So I have show and tell today.
Okay.
I've been working for years, literally years on this project, and I think I'm ready to show a little bit of it all.
Oh, you are, David?
Yes.
Whoa.
I'm very excited about it. It's actually one of the reasons I wake up in the morning smiling and whistling and skipping
And for the
everywhere I
record,
go.
before he starts,
Wake
if
up
any of
whistling.
us end up being in a car accident or suicide, and
It wasn't
not
a
real.
car accident, nor was it a
Not real.
suicide.
Right.
Okay,
Just so
Bring
you
it up
know,
there.
none of us are feeling
Now you make me
remotely
sick.
suicidal,
No.
nor are we accident prone. We're very careful people.
we just believe in the truth. And
We
it's-
just, yeah, okay. If it's true that the media, the mainstream media, and even some of the alternative media is blaming all the illegal drug trafficking of heroin and cocaine on Latinos and Italians and Colombians, and none of them are looking seriously at the white folk who have all the big planes, who have the way to cover it up, then they're not being honest. In fact, it's kind of a racist thing. So part of my big project with Bob High, which is called Vansterdam Comics, it's a 420-page color comic that will be out, well, it'll be ready to be published maybe September. And so I'm really looking forward to that because I've been working on it for years. It's taken years to get this far, but we're in the home stretch now. And the last few pages, last say 100 pages of this 420-page comic book is all about the CIA drug trafficking and how the biggest drug dealers in the world, if you want to look at it just from a factual basis, the evidence is it's like George Bush and his buddies at the CIA and Skull and Bones who have the connections and the attitude necessary to be the biggest drug dealers in the world. And they blame it on the Colombians and the Mexicans and the Italians and Asian gangs and motorcycle enthusiasts, because that's what the biggest drug dealers would do, is they'd have enough money and enough power to get away with it, not go to jail. I think Ollie North got like 20 hours community service or something like that. I'll get the actual figure when we get to Iran-Contra.
Become the president.
Yeah, oh, right. You become the president of the United States. And not only that, you get to start a political dynasty where automatically, because of your name, there's a 50% chance that you're also going to become president of the United States. It's like a new kind of king system, except with more turnover.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Bushes or Clintons.
Bushes
maybe.
or Clintons, right. Those are your two choices forever.
It is an aristocracy down there.
Yeah.
It is.
Well,
the form of government is...
Oligarchy? Is that a rule of the rich?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those. Right now...
But there's actually royal-type families that are there in their own minds, not, like the Queen of England. But, like, there is this sort of... It's just an Idea City concept that Canada is far more free, really, because the U.S. really does have only control by big names and families.
Well, you don't have to be a psychologist to understand that bloodlines and breeding is going to be the preoccupation of these power-hungry...
controllers.
Rulers. I guess I like the word ruler because it's very simple.
Neo-fascists.
One of my favorite terms was Gatewood Galbraith came up with this when he said, the petrochemical, pharmaceutical, military, industrial, transnational, corporate, fascist, elite sons of bitches. And if you got to sum it up in a nutshell, if you got big nuts, you can
Rest in peace.
stick that there.
That's a lot of shell.
I think he's departed.
Gatewood Galbraith.
Actors, yeah.
He lived to a ripe old age. But some of the people who I discuss in this radical comic book did not make it to a ripe old age. And I think some of the reasons, that's what the part I'm writing now is the CIA's Greatest Hits Volume 1, the 60s.
You're making me nervous here.
Then you go into the 70s and 80s. Oh, they like to kill people.
I
It's
know
one
the
of the
Greatest
things
Hits
they do.
immediately made me think, geez.
It turns out the guys who finance coups and run drugs and run guns also like to shoot people in the head or get them suicided.
Get rid of them.
Yeah. So anyway, would you like a chance to see the new pages coming up on the CIA part of the Vansterdam comic book?
How could we not?
Okay, well,
honored to.
I'll just put this down and
Yes,
show you
that's
some stuff. Maybe you could be my microphone. We could
hold
share
it.
your microphone. Or you could be a mic
Dolby.
stand.
There you go.
I'm a
The
mic
world's
stand.
most glamorous mic stand, everybody. Jody Emery. Also one of the
I do it for the cause. I do it for the cause.
One of the
Also,
smartest,
one of the smartest.
one of the smartest mic stands I've ever met. The
I'm a
first
cam
page
stand.
It's a quote from Proudhon. I'll fill in the blanks here. None of these have been lettered yet. This is how recent these have been made. But
Right.
the quote is, what are laws? What laws are? Laws are cobwebs for the rich and chains for the poor and fishing nets in the hands of government. So then the next 2 pages are the Skull and Bones introduction, who it was made by. Skull and Bones was a fraternity at Yale, and the whole funding of the creation of it was opium money. It was Sam Russell, who was America's biggest opium smuggler, who started the fraternity with his brother, William Russell. And these are the founders of Skull and Bones, William Russell and Alphonso Taft. Now, Taft had a son who went on to be the president of the United States and the first one to sign the anti-opium treaties, which basically started the 20th century drug war. These guys also made the most money in America from the 19th century drug war, so maybe they were missing their during the times of drug peace, they were like, hey, we never made as much money as we did back then, let's do that again. And they used their influence, and it was a conflict of interest, not a conspiracy. It just works out this way when you have secret societies that put presidents into power. And they've put 3 into power so far.
They have.
Skull and Bones and the CIA. This is a statue of Nathan Hale, which was America's first spy. He was like, I regret that I only have 1 life to give for my country. And there's a statue of him in Yale, and there's a statue of him in front of the CIA. And it's no coincidence that the Yale slang for secret society member is the exact same word as the CIA slang for spy. Spook. Yeah, because the CIA was created by Skull and Bones. These are all Skull and Bones members that created the CIA. That's Henry Stimson, Robert Lovett, Prescott Bush, George Bush's father, also Skull and Bones member, and Averell Harriman. And all these guys are bigwigs in the Republican and Democratic parties of the United States, and they all were the major guys who made the CIA. And the last 3 of them also lived in the same island in Florida, Jupiter Island.
They're aliens.
They're all oligarchs.
Bad.
They're rulers, rich rulers. Now, the guy who staffed the CIA was Skull and Bones. The guy who was in charge of MK Ultra mind control programs is Skull and Bones. The Bundy brothers, McGeorge and William Bundy? I want to say William.
I think it is.
Yeah, Bill Bundy. Anyway, these guys were high-ranking members of Kennedy's cabinet, and they were also right at the center of the Bay of Pigs invasion, Vietnam War, and the Kennedy assassination. All these citations and sources for this will also be on these pages. So if you want to look into any of this more, this is just the beginning of your drug history education, folks. Because you can Google all this shit, and there's tons of stuff online, and I'm taking most of this from books.
This is Malmo's Herb Museum. Does that have info or no? Where do you have most of your info?
Well, a lot of this is not assembled anywhere, especially from the drug angle. There was only a couple of books and 1 online article that kind of tries to do what I'm also doing, but mine is like the best illustrated of them all. Because we all learn with pictures, right? So we all remember things with images. So that's what I tried to do here. So that's Richard Drain. He was a mastermind at the Bay of Pigs. That's Charles Whitehouse. He was an ambassador to Laos and Thailand in the 70s. And that guy down there is Evan Galbraith, who was involved in the Guatemala invasion. He actually, during the Guatemala invasion, the Skull and Bones flag appears in Guatemala during that time. And during the Bay of Pigs invasion, they printed skulls and bones on the landing craft. So you're seeing this iconography is coming again and again. It's like they can't help but sign their names to it, right? And another these are all Skull and Bones members. Another Skull and Bones member was William F. Buckley Jr., who went on to have his own right-wing talk show, debate Chomsky, and become like a darling of the right, kind of a smart man's Bill O'Reilly with a better accent.
Right.
But,
and a sense of humor.
And a sense of humor. But he did hang out with E. Howard Hunt in Mexico in the 50s before either of them came to prominence, right? And E.
Howard Hunt, the famous White House plumber.
E. Howard Hunt, famous White House plumber, famous Bay of Pigs guy.
Yeah.
This is getting heavy.
And also,
famous assassin or head of the assassin team for Kennedy.
Apparently he was one of the drug runners back in the 40s when it was OSS, too.
Wow.
So this is an ambitious project, and hopefully it'll be available, when's this?
Oh, well, it'll be, I think, ready to publish in September. So I've never published a comic
Available
book
next
before.
year, maybe.
Yeah, hopefully. Well, the sooner the better, right? Because the peeps got to know. The peeps got to know the truth.
Oh, yeah.
This is Kerry and Boren, and they were in charge of overseeing Iran-Contra. And so they were both Skull and Bones. It's amazing how many people who were involved in high-level drug trafficking on part of the government were also Skull and Bones. So what a coincidence. What are the odds? I don't know. A Brazilian.
This is a great drawing.
This is,
piece is awesome.
This is George Herbert Walker Bush. In his Skull and Bones class photo, he sits right next to the clock, or stands right next to the clock. And he also is famously a picture of him taken. Nobody else in the CIA, Alan Dulles, Colby, nobody got their picture taken right on CIA's big floor design of its own emblem. This is the only guy who's been so at the heart of, like, he grew up as a CIA brat. His father was in military intelligence. He was destined. He was the only guy who was growing up destined to be head of the CIA. Mm-hmm. And he claims he never was in the CIA until he started to run it. Mm-hmm. One of his many claims, like, I don't know where I was when JFK was shot. Mm-hmm. Amazing, the disconnect.
I don't know much about Alan Dulles and George Bush's relationship.
Well, they're all kind of part of the same business group of Wall Street lawyers. Prescott Bush was a Wall Street lawyer and Brown Brothers Harriman. And the Dulleses were both Wall Street lawyers in all of Sullivan and Cromwell. So they all hung out together, they ate food together, they partied together, they golfed together.
So you got lots of evidence here is what we're getting at. We're getting at, there's a lot of stuff here. The Bushes and the Rockefellers, the Dulles brothers were lawyers for the Rockefellers. The Bushes and the Rockefellers were in business since 1905.
Right.
So the CIA's early drug history was with the Green Gang. Paul Hellawell with the Green Gang. He later went on to fund the Bay of Pigs invasion and Air America. He owned all the airplanes in Air America, right? And then Lucky Luciano, the head of the mafia in the United States for decades, the center of organized crime. He started cooperating with the CIA during World War II to break up strikes, to help invade Italy, and then to set up the French Connection, the famous French Connection. But Bush started his drug dealing as an offshore oil rig guy. He had an oil rig, one of the first offshore oil rigs in the world, called the Scorpion, and it was located conveniently right between Havana, which in the 50s was a swinging place run by the mafia, and Florida, which was the easiest place to smuggle anything in the world because it was so porous. It had 1,000 islands and a million places to hide a boat, and there's no way you can stop drugs coming into Florida. There's just no way. Mm-hmm. So he brought it in on his crew conveyances. No one would be checked when they went to and from work every day. So it was the easiest way to avoid supervision. Now, back in 46, 47, the winter of 46, 47, all the mobsters had a conference in Havana. It was called the Havana Conference. And this is where they decided to make Cuba the center of all drug trafficking in the world. And guys that were there, Luciano and Lansky, who ran everything, and then the sub-bosses, Trafficante was in charge of both Miami and Havana, and Marcelo was in charge of New Orleans. And these guys had underlings like Jack Ruby was basically in the employ of all the bosses, but mainly Trafficante, and Ferry, David Ferry, who you might remember, Joe Pesci's character in JFK.
Famous.
Yeah, he was under the control of Marcelo. And these guys were all meeting to carve up the drug market for themselves. Now, David Ferry, he was head of the Civil Air Patrol. And in his Civil Air Patrol, there was two very important students. These are kids growing up, want to become part of the military. And his two famous students were Lee Harvey Oswald in that photo and Barry Seal, who there's a movie coming up about Barry Seal starring, I think it's Tom Cruise.
What?
Yeah, and it's going to be out next year. So all this is going to be just as familiar as Killing the Messenger made later drug dealing. Barry Seal is all the other drug dealing, the early drug dealing, and right up until then. He was killed in 86. So Barry Seal, he starts out as David Ferry's student, and he later, let me just read to you a little bit of his resume. Seal participated in many of the signal events in America during the second half of the 20th century, running guns to Fidel Castro in the mountains of Cuba, flying at the Bay of Pigs invasion, piloting a getaway plane after the assassination of JFK, flying into the Golden Triangle during America's secret war in Laos. Barry Seal even had a cameo role in the Watergate scandal. And if you look into all these events, you see the same players, Cubans, intelligence guys, underworld guys, same guys doing the same thing all the time in military. And it's the same guys for decades doing the drug dealing. I wouldn't be surprised if their kids are doing it today. So in 59, Castro takes over Cuba, and all the mafia guys are sent away. You can't be in Cuba anymore, and they're pissed off. And the CIA's pissed off because that's all their drug dealing goes right through Cuba. They want it back.
And it goes to Mexico after now?
The French connection starts out in Asia, and then it goes to France and gets turned into heroin. And then it goes into a bunch of places, but it eventually arrives in Cuba and then Florida. That's the French connection. And that got screwed up by Castro. And so then they decided, well, we're going to put an assassination group together to get Castro. And this is the only known photo of Operation 40, Op 40. And these guys end up being guys that you see over and over again in all sorts of things. Felix Rodriguez is there. He's a pilot, and you see him again and again. This is Porter Goss. He ended up being the head of the CIA under W. And that's Barry Seal. And this guy ended up getting caught in 1970 with 70% of the cocaine and 30% of the heroin going into America. And then this is Frank Sturgis, and all these guys end up coming up together again in the Kennedy assassination and Watergate and other things too in Laos. This is Fidel Castro taking over the West Indies Sugar Company, which I think Prescott Bush had a bunch of money in. And this is about the Bay of Pigs. Bay of Pigs had landing craft, two of which were the Houston, not landing craft, sorry, invading craft, like big boats, big ships. And one of them was called the Houston and one of them was called the Barbara. And George lived in Houston and was married to Barbara. And the whole operation was called Operation Zapata. And he had Zapata oil. So it could be like a three-time coincidence of that, or it could be that he's with all his Skull and Bones buddies helping the invasion of Cuba. His job was rounding up people, anti-Castro Cubans in Florida during the time. So he was probably very much involved with the Bay of Pigs invasion. And that's the guy in the Op 40 photo who ended up running all those drugs in the 70s, getting caught with most of the drugs coming into the United States. And then this is about Kennedy and how he basically got in the way of the guys making money off war and the guys making money off the drug war. And that's why a lot of people think he was assassinated, both for his anti-war things and his anti-drug war things. Now, it turns out he smoked pot in the White House with Mary Pinchot Meyer. And then he tripped with Mary Pinchot Meyer and did LSD with her. Yeah. And it turns out, I think I'm the first to discover this, I'm not sure, but he tripped out in May of 63. What else was he doing in May of 63? He was writing his most famous peace speech of all time, the American University speech. It's like, what kind of speech do we want? Not the Pax Americana, forced on by gun pointed. No, we want not just peace in our time, but peace in all time. You know, and this whole vision of this just and new society. Chomsky says, all his internal memos say, we're not pulling out of Vietnam without victory. But I think he was lying to the generals who fucked him in the Bay of Pigs invasion, fucked him in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think he was lying to those guys in an internal memorandum. He was telling the truth in his big speech to the world, his big peace speech to the world that he wrote or conceived of while tripping on LSD with his favorite mistress. I think that's the more...
Mary Pinchot Meyer, who was also assassinated.
Who was also assassinated a year later, less than a year later. And we get to that. That's the part I'm writing about now, is all the people who conveniently die right after JFK or die to cover up the drug deals. So this is Castro, and Trujillo was a guy in Dominican Republic. I think that's how... Rafael Trujillo, I think that's how you pronounce his name. But anyway, they're both was targeted for assassination. Now, Bush says he can't remember where he was when Kennedy got shot. But there's photos of guys who look exactly like he does standing in front of the Texas School Book Depository a few minutes later. He spoke in Dallas the night before at the Oil Well Association.
That is crazy.
That's crazy. And there's evidence of that came out in this book, Family of Secrets by Russ Baker. And then there's two documents that place him in Dallas at the time or associated with the assassination at the time. One is he flew to Tyler, Texas, and then phoned in, I'm in Tyler, Texas, and I have some information, which turned out to be just a red herring. And the other one was Hoover didn't like Bush at all, so he placed him connected to the assassination and the Cubans that he was associated with. George Bush of the CIA, he outed George Bush in an internal memo and then left it for history to find out. That Hoover must have hated the Bushes to do that to him, but... That's what people figure. So this is where Bush actually was during the assassination. This is the Texas School depository, and right next to it was a Dow Tech building. That's where Bush was, in that window, just after the first flight of stairs, where a lot of people think he was, because actually I have from On the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison about this oil man who gets caught running out of there and questioned, and I got that corroborated from When They Kill a President by Roger Craig's 71. So On the Trail of the Assassins was written in the 60s. This is in the 70s, before George Bush even got became a household name.
Right.
And they're putting it on this Texas oil guy who ran out of the school book depository but wasn't investigated.
It's all interesting clues.
It's all interesting clues. And other people have this photograph of a guy who looks identical to W. Yeah. And he would have been 17 years old. And the kid, no, W books.
Oh, W.
W was at Dealey Plaza at the same time. There's so many presidents in Dealey Plaza.
And how old was W?
17 years old. It was Bring Your Son to Work Day at the CIA. This ties in later on with the death of JFK Jr. and W's kind of suspicious behavior in and around that time. He could have been the only president in on both assassinations of the Kennedy Sr. and Jr. Ruby, turns out, also had his mob connections there and a whole bunch of suspicious things going on with poor Jack Ruby. And then this one goes on to explain how the French intelligence ran drugs out of Southeast Asia until around 65 when the Americans took over and put ground troops into Vietnam, and how Bush was sent there to kind of manage it all. There's this quote from Air America. Great movie, Air America. It had Robert Downey Jr. and Mel Gibson in it, and it's actually, Mel Gibson does a great job. And they explain how in Air America was this CIA-owned airplane company in Laos at the time, basically running a secret war. And they didn't have actual troops in Laos, but they had all these military advisors who basically trained the Hmong tribes people to fight against the Pathet Lao, which was the communist guys. And they funded that all with drugs. And that was William Colby, who was head of the CIA, and he had Operation Phoenix, which is this old murder and torture program the CIA had going on. And George Bush decides to visit there in 67 and the early part of 68, right before the Tet Offensive. And he meets with all these people. His son, W, says, oh, my dad met with high-ranking members and low-ranking members and a whole bunch of people in Vietnam, Laos, and Thailand, which was the heart of opium growing place. It's a strange coincidence there. Trafficante was also going there for the same reasons at around the same time. And then this is the last page I've got done so far. It's Sam and Chuck Giancana, the high-ranking members of the mafia, and they're just talking about all the money that they're going to make in Vietnam. And then, there's a very famous photo of the fall of Saigon. And there's a helicopter at the roof of the American embassy, and it's a whole bunch of people trying to get out of Vietnam at the end of the Vietnam War. It turns out that's an Air America helicopter. The first one's in and the last one's out of both Vietnam and Laos was the CIA drug traffickers. Mm-hmm. And that's where we leave it, folks, but we'll get into the 70s with Manuel Noriega and Iran, and then the Iran-Contra scandal, the 80s, and then whatever is left that can trickle out in about the 90s and the 2000s and the current decade that we're in about how corrupt our government is and how they're making all the money off the drug war. And that's one of the reasons why, unless people know about this stuff, it'll never stop. Because there'll always be that economic incentive and there'll always be that threat of assassination. Hey, I don't know, but there's that implicit threat, right? If the CIA can just wipe out a president and then kill all the people connected to him, then nobody else feels very safe. And I think that's how, in a representative democracy, power controls through subtle threats of power and getting away with shit. So if they don't get away with shit, if we expose their evil machinations, their lies, their drug dealing, their assassinations, their secret wars, then maybe we can transform our society into that peace in all time that JFK was talking about.
Or at least know that we told people the truth.
Yeah. At the very least, you can look yourself in the mirror and say, well, I wasn't a coward while I was alive shortly on planet Earth. Yeah. That feels good, not being a coward. And I think your chances of survival are better the brave path than the cowardly path. So we should do our best to, once this stuff comes out, to get it out in all manner of communications, online, in comic book form, in links and stuff you can pass on Facebook, and everyone can take part in the exposure of the white guys that control the drug trade.
Yeah. David, I think that research is fantastic that you put together there. It's something that is unique and I don't think exists anywhere else in that sort of, I mean, all that information is out there, but nobody's compiled it quite like you have. And it's going to be exciting to see this. Now, you're also working on this in a book form, is what I remember.
Yeah. Well, I want it in every form because I think it's so important that we understand both what the drugs do and what the drug war does. Because if you just understand the drugs but not the drug war, then you only understand half the stuff you're going to need to know to legalize effectively. It's a control mechanism. It's always been a control mechanism, the rich and powerful on the poor and the weak. I mean, back in Jesus' time, it was like, hey, Jesus healed the poor, and he did it for free, and the people would look after his apostles, and they'd travel around healing people with oil, just like it said in Mark 6:13. And then the establishment doesn't like that. Hey, we got all the magic, we got all the medicine, our priests are the powerful ones. You're cutting in on our grass, man. Get out of here. Yeah, this is our economy. And forever, that's human evolution, is the few that control the biggest chunk of the economy, thinking up excuses to keep their power and privilege. And then the rest of us say, hey, no, we want justice, we want equality, we want to share the world. We each want a good life before we die. We don't want it just to be a few rich people having a good life and everyone else suffering and wondering where their next meal is going to come from. We each want to share the world. And that's why in the Bible it says, the riches of the earth are for all. Right? So this is a long war. This whole war of the powerful versus the powerless is the longest war running around. And we've got to end it and move to this harmony state that dreamers can envision. You know, John Lennon, JFK, Bob Marley, these people can envision a new world, and they get shot for it. And if enough of us, it's like that thing in Alice in Wonderland, if enough of us wake up, all of a sudden we'll stop living in that dream, you know? Anyway,
Thank you
I'm
very
high.
much, David. That was absolutely amazing. I really appreciate you sharing that with us and sharing that wonderful knowledge with everyone.
I love show and tell.